Hello, everyone. Today we're going to watch a shocking video about Rick Harrison, the star of Pawn Stars. Recently, a video was leaked that shows how Rick is being treated in prison after being found guilty in a major case. Does he really have to pay for his actions? Let's find out. The newly leaked video shows an unbelievable scene of Rick Harrison, the star of Pawn Stars, and how he's being treated in prison. He used to live a life of luxury, but is now having to deal with unexpected hardships and challenges. This video will make you question everything you thought you knew about him. Please like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Let us know what you think about this case and the problems Rick Harrison is facing. Let's look into the hidden truths and untold stories. Pawn Stars was a reality TV show that captivated millions of viewers and turned a small pawn shop in Las Vegas into an American cultural icon. It was a family business that promised an authentic slice of old America. At the center of it all was Rick Harrison, a sharp, straightforward, and often funny man who became a familiar face on TV for over a decade. Viewers watched as he haggled over old guns, rare coins, and signed memorabilia. But little did they know that a completely different story was slowly being told behind the scenes. On a fateful Wednesday morning, nothing was planned, but the scene in the Las Vegas courtroom was as dramatic as an episode of a TV show. Rick Harrison, who now had gray hair and a tired face, stood in front of a federal courtroom surrounded by armed guards. The lights in the room made beads of sweat appear on his forehead, and his eyes flickered with worry. Gone were the clever jokes and the familiar jingles of the pawn shop, and there was only silence and a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. Music continued to play across the room, and Pam Bondi, the former Attorney General of Florida, who was known for her tough style in court, walked in. She held a black folder that said Harrison Files Confidential Evidence in her hands. When Bondi spoke, the whole room seemed to hold their breath. She didn't use any flowery language. Her voice was cold and steady, like a blade. "Your Honor," she said, raising a stack of papers, "what I have here is not just a collection of papers. This is the blueprint of years of tax fraud, money laundering through shell companies, and worst of all, a network of trafficked stolen artifacts, many of which were once shown to millions of people on national TV. The room was eerily quiet at that moment. The picture of Rick Harrison as a man who loved history and appraised antiques with skill and a hint of sarcasm fell apart. In its place was a picture of someone who was accused of taking advantage of his fame, breaking the public's trust, and hiding millions of dollars through a decades-long network of secret transactions. Could this really be true? Could the person who built a career on trust and honesty be the one manipulating everything behind the scenes? Was the American dream sold at the gold and silver pawn shop just a well-made facade, hiding a much darker truth? Within hours, the media went crazy. Pawn Stars star Rick Harrison breaks down in court. Pam Bondi presents the evidence. Harrison faces life in prison, was the headline across the internet and newspapers. Fans were shocked to learn what Rick Harrison had been hiding all these years. Critics were shocked, and at the center of it all was the man who used to greet millions of viewers with a smile and is now facing the possibility of a life sentence. But how did it get to this? To understand how serious what happened in that courtroom was, we need to go back a long time before the fame, before the bargaining, before the cameras. Because Rick Harrison didn't just wake up one day and decide to commit federal crimes. It was a slow, steady decline that was cleverly disguised as smart business sense. A lot of small decisions led to the fall of a multimillion-dollar music empire. The story starts in San Diego in 1965, where Rick was born into a family that had been through a lot. He was diagnosed with epilepsy when he was 8 years old and spent most of his childhood bedridden, alone, and glued to the TV. Historical documentaries became his escape and, ironically, his future. He would say that those years taught him two things: how to observe people and how to survive as a teenager. Rick dropped out of school in the 10th grade, not because he wasn't smart, but because he felt like he had something to prove. he started buying and selling things like watches, sound systems, and rare books. It was clear that he was good at business. In 1989, Rick and his father, Richard Old Man Harrison, opened the Gold and Silver Pawn Shop. The business was steady but nothing special until Pawn Stars came out in 2009. This reality TV show made them famous overnight from a small start. Gold and Silver Pawn Shop, a run-down shop on the edge of the Las Vegas Strip, became a famous spot where celebrities, collectors, and regular people came to trade old things. The show was meant to look unscripted, with some comedy, some drama, and always a lesson about history. But while the cameras showed Rick as a man who cared deeply about truth and real value, it became harder to find the truth behind closed doors, according to Pam Bondi's investigation. Things started to go badly after Pawn Stars reached its peak. Rick's newfound fame and huge wealth brought both opportunities and temptations. He grew his business and worked with appraisers, auction houses, and private collectors. It became harder to tell the difference between what was legal and what was for profit. Tax records showed that he wasn't reporting income from Hive items. Money was flowing through shell companies and into foreign accounts. Payments came from unknown buyers who never showed up on invoices. Several famous items were used as evidence that Rick was guilty. International law enforcement agencies reported a Civil War sword, a Native American ceremonial pipe, and even a one-of-a-kind Picasso sketch as stolen artifacts on the show Music. Viewers had seen these items being valued and traded like normal goods, but in reality, these were not normal transactions. Bondi's investigation team watched over 10 years of the show and compared what they saw with physical evidence they found in the pawn shop's storage and Rick's home. It was shocking what they found in the safes. Some items had questionable legal origins, while others were clearly illegal. If you found this video interesting, please like and subscribe to stay up to date on the latest news. Join the conversation and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about Rick Harrison's situation? Let's watch the video to find out more. Forensic financial experts worked for months to follow the money trail. Invoices were changed, accounting books went missing, and employees who used to laugh in front of fearful people were called to court, and some cooperated with investigators while others were charged. When Rick was arrested, federal prosecutors had what one source called an irrefutable case. Over 100 pieces of evidence, 17 stolen artifacts that had been proven to exist, and millions of dollars in unreported income. The charges weren't just procedural, they were carefully thought out, strategic, and sharp. The trial quickly turned into a media frenzy. Rick walked into court in a dark gray suit accompanied by his lawyers. Prosecution didn't waste any time getting started. They started with simple, clear, and easy to understand tax evasion charges. Next came money laundering, which involved a complicated chain of transactions between companies that only existed on paper. Finally, the killer charge of trafficking stolen cultural artifacts. That's when Pam Bondi stood up and started showing the receipts for every transaction, item, and day. A former FBI analyst who later watched the trial said that Bondi treated the case as if she were each artifact was a victim. Each fake invoice was a fingerprint, and Rick, he was in the lineup. Rick's breakdown in court didn't happen when he heard about the alleged amount of money or the possible life sentence waiting for him. It happened when Bondi held up a photo of a stolen Torah scroll from a Holocaust museum in Poland, which Rick had bought in cash, never registered. He didn't cry because he felt guilty. He cried because he was scared, because even Rick knew what was going on at that moment. Outside the pawn shop, people reacted in real time. Pawn Stars was quietly taken down from streaming services, and the Google reviews for the pawn shop were full of comments ranging from heartbroken to angry. Fans posted side-by-side pictures of favorite episodes and trial footage, not believing that the two pictures were of the same person. News networks aired special shows warning of the dangers of idolizing reality TV stars. Even former co-stars from the show, people publicly distanced themselves from Rick. This was the biggest fall in reality TV history, but there was still a lot that hadn't been said. This case wasn't just about Rick Harrison, it was also about those around him, the deals that weren't shown, the employees who knew too much, the artifacts that might never be found again, and the prosecutor who wouldn't back down. This wasn't just the story of one man's fall, it was the story of the price of lying, the price of fame, and what you just read is just the surface. Are you ready to see how deep it goes? Long before Rick Harrison became a TV star, he was a child trying to find his place in the world. There were no cameras, no signatures, and no multi-million-dollar pawn shops. Instead, there were silent struggles and a bedroom that turned into a prison. Rick was born on March 22, 1965, in Lexington, North Carolina. He was the third child in a modest family. His father, Richard Benjamin Harrison, later known as Old Man, was a veteran of the U.S. Navy with a sharp tongue and an even sharper intuition. His mother, Joan Rue, was a real estate agent and was practical and tough. Their life wasn't easy. They moved around a lot looking for work and opportunities until they finally settled in San Diego, California. When Rick was 8 years old, he was diagnosed with epilepsy. His seizures would happen suddenly and without warning, leaving him bedridden for days at a time. Doctors told his family that there was no cure, only management for an illness. As an active and interested boy, Rick's diagnosis felt like a sentence. School was hard for him not because he wasn't a good student, he was, but because of the social environment. Other kids didn't understand his condition, and teachers didn't know how to deal with it, so Rick pulled away, stopped trying to fit in, and spent his time reading and, more importantly, watching TV. Every day when his seizures kept him in bed, Rick would collapse into a deep sleep and watch TV. Unlike most kids, Rick was hooked on historical documentaries about ancient Rome, World War II, the Renaissance, and the Industrial Revolution. He soaked it all up like a sponge, remembering dates, events, facts, and figures. He started to see patterns, question motives, and slowly develop a strange but deep respect for the past. This love of history would shape his whole future, though no one knew that at the time when Rick turned 17, his life took a huge turn. Another turn, he dropped out of school before finishing 10th grade, but this wasn't a failure story, it was a choice. By that time, Rick had already started buying and selling small items like high-end calculators and audio equipment. He had found that money was the only thing that would make people stop doubting his condition. Las Vegas called to the Harrison family, as it had to many others. It was a land of opportunity, a city where reinventing oneself was a way of life. In 1981, the whole family packed up and moved to Las Vegas. Rick's instincts got stronger in Vegas, a city known for its risk and deception. He worked in his father's pawn shop, where he learned not only how to value things but also how to read people, negotiate, and most importantly, how to close a deal. But the business wasn't easy, competition was fierce, and the traditional model of selling used goods wasn't enough to keep the family afloat. Then something changed. Rick suggested switching the shop's model from selling used goods to there was a big problem, though. At the time, Vegas laws only allowed a certain number of pawn licenses, so there was a long waiting list and not much chance of getting one. Rick did what he always did. He studied and waited. When a license finally came open in 1989, he and his father were ready. They opened gold and silver pawn shop on Las Vegas Boulevard, just a few blocks from the Strip. The location wasn't fancy and the sign was simple, but something was going on inside. The Harrisons weren't just taking customers. Gold chains and guitars were traded for stories. Each item had a history. Each transaction was not just a negotiation over price but also over meaning. Customers started to notice that Rick had an encyclopedic memory for strange details, and word spread that there was a pawn shop owner in Vegas who knew more about a war medal than the veteran who owned it. Over time, the shop became a local attraction. They had seen everything from fake eggs to shrunken heads. Rick never stopped learning. He read a lot. He constantly went to auctions and estate sales across the country and made connections with experts. He wasn't just building a business, he was building a brand. Then he got a call that would change his Life in the early 2000s, reality TV was becoming very popular, and producers were looking for new formats and untapped markets. One of them walked into gold and silver pawn shop looking for something interesting and found Rick. The idea for Pawn Stars was simple, a reality TV show set in a family pawn shop that focused on strange, rare, and even silly items. He didn't want the show to just be a bunch of scripted drama. He wanted it to teach history and give viewers something they didn't know before. And somehow, he got what he wanted. When Pawn Stars premiered on the History Channel in 2009, it was an instant hit. Viewers loved the mix of strange items, tense negotiations, and the banter between Rick, his son Corey, and Chumley, Rick's childhood friend. They also loved the wise old men who appeared on the show, Man Richard, but Rick was what really made the show a hit. He was smart, honest, and trustworthy. He wasn't easily fooled, but he wasn't ruthless either. He made learning cool, he made bargaining an art form, and he brought history to life. The show quickly became one of the most popular on cable. It led to spin-offs, merchandise book deals, and invitations to appear everywhere. Rick became a real celebrity and was asked to speak at business conferences. Rick made cameos in movies and even worked as a consultant for museums. The gold and silver pawn shop went from being a local store to a worldwide tourist attraction. People from all over the world came to see where history was bought and sold. Every day, hundreds of people lined up outside the shop to see Rick in action. But fame comes with responsibility. The shop had to keep adding new items to keep the crowds interested. As deals got bigger, items became more valuable, and tax forms numbers got harder to read. Rick started investing in side projects, some of which were legal and some of which were not. He secretly bought real estate in Las Vegas and put money into private collections. He started trading not only antiques but also influence items. Experts were paid to authenticate items without proper verification, and some documents disappeared or were faked by the time the federal government caught on. Rick was running a complicated web of from the outside. His empire still looked strong. His show was still airing, the ratings were steady, and his fans stayed loyal. Rick Harrison was still the man who loved history, adored his father, and had achieved the American dream. But behind the scenes, cracks were starting to show. That Rick Harrison wasn't just a boy reading books alone in bed. He was a businessman with too many secrets and too much to lose, according to court records that were made public. Later, this is when Rick did the most wrong things, both legally and morally. He stopped asking himself if what he was doing was right. He only asked if it was possible, and in Las Vegas, anything is possible if the price is right. Rick once said in an interview, "Everything has a story, and every story has a price." He didn't know, or maybe didn't want to admit, that his life story was being changed not by his fans or the cameras, but by the prosecutors. Rick Harrison's rise was truly remarkable. It was ambitious and had the distinct flavor of American identity, but as the saying goes, the higher you climb, the harder you fall. For Rick Harrison, the first taste of fame was addicting. One day he was just a smart and charming businessman in Las Vegas. The next day he was a national celebrity. His face appeared on billboards all over the country. Rick became a cultural icon after Pawn Stars aired in over 150 countries. He was no longer just a pawn shop owner. He was an expert on the value of America. The show's unique mix of pop culture, historical knowledge, and dramatic negotiations quickly found an audience. People saw Rick as a trustworthy storyteller who could spot a real Civil War sword in an instant and even name the general who once held it. He seemed like an honest man who respected history, had an eye for authenticity, but fame came with something much more dangerous, the illusion of invincibility. Rick never shied away from the spotlight. In interviews, he played up his image as a self-made man who lived for his family and was honest to the core. But behind the scenes, fame was slowly changing him. As Pawn Stars became a huge hit, the line between Rick's real self and his TV persona started to blur. Rick's shop went from being a local store to a Vegas landmark, and tour buses started stopping there. Along with tourists who didn't buy anything, hundreds of people lined up every day just to take pictures with Rick. T-shirts, bobblehead dolls, and coffee mugs with his face and famous sayings sold like crazy. Rick signed book deals, gave speeches, and flew to events on his private jet, all while the cameras were rolling. At first, his fame wasn't too bad. He used it to make the pawn industry more respected in society. He even talked about it in his autobiography. That was true for a while, sharing history through objects with the public to teach them. But then everything changed. As Rick became more famous, his business model changed into something that no one could recognize. The pawn shop, which used to be proud of its honest negotiations and strong community ties, started catering to cameras and famous guests, pushing aside real collectors and tough sellers in favor of people who looked good on TV. Items were staged, scenes were rehearsed, deals were changed to make things more exciting, and Rick, who was once details, became very important, and the truth started to be ignored. The employees were the first to notice that the focus was no longer on valuing items but on keeping up the image. Some longtime employees quietly quit, while others stayed for the fame, the paycheck, or the chance to be on one of the most popular reality shows. Then the party started. Las Vegas has a way of showing people's true selves, and Rick's growing desire for luxury was shown when he was seen gambling in high-end clubs. Hollywood producers, art dealers, and foreign officials all wanted to work with the man who could turn trash into treasure. Deals were made over cocktails, and antiques were traded in private rooms. Some of these items had never been seen on the show because they weren't flashy enough, but they were very valuable. Some were worth so much that they would get police attention if they were sold on the open market. At first, Rick didn't pay attention to. He had a lawyer and an accountant, and he thought he was just playing the same game as everyone else, only smarter. But the risks kept building beneath the surface. Some appraisers who had been on Pawn Stars later said in private interviews that they had been forced to inflate values. Items with questionable provenance were often checked with a handshake and a wink. The production crew wasn't there to authenticate artifacts. They were there to film a TV show, and Rick was the star. No one questioned the star's unchecked power. Rick started buying expensive things without the right paperwork. He used middlemen to get rare antiques from private collections. Many of these items were thought to have been illegally taken from the countries where they came from. They included ancient scrolls, ritual weapons, coins, and even religious artifacts that weren't listed in museums records. Rick said he wasn't stealing, he was just keeping history alive. That was the story he told himself, that was the mask he wore, but his finances started to look more complicated. He set up a network of LLC, some of which only existed on paper. Money was moved between accounts for no clear reason. Many items disappeared from the shop's records. Items sold off camera never showed up on tax returns. The value of his personal collection stored in a temperature-controlled vault under his house started to rival that of his collection in the safe. The assets of some museums, but the shop Pawn Stars kept getting high ratings, and Rick remained the personification of trust and a living encyclopedia of cultural value. No one asked where he got these rare items, and some transactions weren't made clear. Rick became confident from years of public praise and started to think he could trick anyone, even the federal government. The turning point came when someone, thought to be a former employee, filed an anonymous report with the IRS not about the show but about Rick. Antiques, but about taxes, income that wasn't reported, questionable deductions, and big transactions that happened through shell companies. At first, it seemed normal for a famous person with a complicated financial life. But as investigators dug deeper, they found something much more sinister. Money was being laundered. Items that had been marked as stolen in international databases were found in Rick's private vault, and artifacts whose origins were not clear were being moved across state and national borders, sometimes by private jet. Then Pam Bondi stepped in. Bondi, who used to be the Attorney General of Florida and was known for going after high-profile financial crime cases, saw Rick Harrison's case as both a legal and a cultural challenge. She saw that a man who had built his reputation on valuing authenticity was about to be exposed as a master of deception. Her investigation would last for years, involve multiple agencies, and include testimonies from dozens of former employees, appraisers, and international collectors. What she found was not only illegal but also offensive. Rick Harrison didn't just fall into crime, he made a fortune from it. As the case went on, the fame that had once protected Rick turned against him. Every episode of Pawn Stars became a possible piece of evidence, and every public statement and interview was looked at with a fresh set of eyes. Fame had given Rick Harrison access to power and influence, but it also brought his enemies to light and led to his downfall. The trap of fame is subtle. One minute, you're the face of a brand, the next you're the subject of a federal investigation. Rick Harrison thought he could control the story, that he could walk the line between reality, entertainment, business, and crime. But as Pam Bondi would soon show in court, reality always finds a way to catch up with you. The man who had figured out the value of everything had forgotten to ask himself what his moral value was, and now he would have to pay the price for months, in government circles as a mystery that no one could solve. On paper, everything seemed legal, profitable, and even admirable. This man had helped people learn about history, raise awareness about priceless antiques, and boost tourism in Las Vegas. But behind the headlines, rumors got louder that something was wrong. Then Pam Bondi showed up. She was the former Attorney General of Florida, and she was known for taking down corruption with precision. She wasn't just careful about bringing criminals to justice. She also took them apart publicly in a methodical and thorough way. When the IRS and FBI realized that Rick Harrison's case was more than just missed tax payments or bookkeeping mistakes, they knew they needed more than just auditors. They needed a hammer. Pam Bondi was that hammer. She didn't start the case with a bang. She started quietly going through documents, calling confidential sources, and putting together a team of forensic accountants and artifact recovery experts. She treated the investigation like a defense campaign. Every name, dollar, and artifact had to lead somewhere. What Bondi found shocked her. She started by looking at Harrison's tax records from the last 12 years. There were dozens of mistakes, including large transfers of money to companies in the Cayman Islands, deductions for items that were never listed in the store's inventory, real estate deals through shell companies, loans given and received and repaid with no clear source of income. Each of these transactions could have a different explanation, but when put together they painted a picture of deliberate deception. Bondi looked into it further and called international police, museums, and auction houses. The more calls she made, the more alarming the responses became. There were missing artifacts and items listed in global stolen asset databases that matched items Rick had publicly shown on Pawn Stars. One item in particular sent a chill down her spine when it was a religious manuscript from the 1600s that was reported missing from a small church in Italy had been shown on an early season of the show. Rick had bought it for $18,000 and later sold it for 3 times that amount. When asked about the item at the time, he had laughed and said, "You don't find things like this every day." Bondi wasn't just looking into a man who wasn't careful with his money. She was also looking into someone who had slyly built illegal behavior into the very structure of his business. She ordered a raid, and federal agents carrying out a sealed search warrant went through Rick's gold and silver pawn shop and several storage units across the state. What they found confirmed Bondi's worst fears: hundreds of artifacts, some whole, some missing labels, and some with nothing at all on them. Many didn't have any records of who owned them. Some of the items matched descriptions of things that had been lost or reported stolen years or even decades before they were found. These included a group of ancient scrolls thought to be from Israel, a medieval war helmet that hadn't been seen in a German museum since the 1970s, and a collection of South American tribal masks that belonged to private collectors who had reported them missing after a suspicious asset liquidation. These weren't things that Rick had found by accident. They were artifacts that had been traded and kept from the public. Bondi didn't stop there. She also looked at hours of unaired Pawn Stars footage that she got by subpoenaing the production company. The footage showed transactions and conversations that happened off camera that had been edited to paint a very different picture of the business. In one clip, Rick could be heard telling a seller to keep quiet about where an item came from in exchange for a higher payment. In another, he ignored an expert's concerns about the legality of an item with "They'll never track it, not with what I've got on hand," he said with a shrug. Bondi's response was quick. She filed charges of tax evasion, money laundering, and trafficking in stolen artifacts. Each charge carried the possibility of serious prison time, and together they meant the possibility of life in prison. But Bondi knew the trial wouldn't be easy. Rick was a famous public figure who was trusted and even admired. She would have to convince the jury that he wasn't just careless, but a criminal would need more than just paper evidence. She needed a story that was based in truth and couldn't be ignored. That's when she started putting together what would become the evidence. A stack of 3 feet of documents, copies, ledgers, contracts, and digital records that were all carefully put together, cross-checked, and time-stamped. She practiced her opening statements like a general getting ready for an attack. Every word was carefully chosen to disarm the audience, and every pause was planned to take control of the room. When the trial started, Bondi didn't stop there. As the pretrial hearings went on, she called witnesses that no one expected, including a former accountant of Rick's who had been fired under suspicious circumstances and a former producer of the show who admitted to taking bribes to ignore mistakes in the paperwork. She even called a former European collector via satellite from Paris to say that he had sold an item to Rick under false pretenses, only to find out later that during the trial, each witness added more information to the puzzle. Rick's defense team tried to fight back by calling the investigation a witch hunt, blaming overzealous prosecutors, and saying there was a misunderstanding about how the pawn industry worked. But Bondi's evidence disproved all of those claims one by one. In one particularly harsh cross-examination, Bondi showed Rick's lead attorney a fake bill from the same day Rick was arrested. Going to a charity event in Miami, the bill said that Rick had personally checked the authenticity of an item at his pawn shop. Bondi just raised an eyebrow and asked, "Is he a magician?" Rick did not understand why the courtroom was laughing so hard. People's reactions changed from doubt to interest to worry to outrage. News outlets started to talk about both the trial and Pam Bondi, saying that she had brought down a famous criminal and was praised for it. In interviews, she stayed calm, focused, and clear. "This case isn't about fame, it's about responsibility." She told reporters, "No one is above the law, not even someone whose job is to value rare and valuable items, because ethics are priceless too." When Bondi told the court about the whole case, every detail was carefully put together, building on the one before it. She talked about the theft of culture, the laundering of history, and the manipulation of audiences who had believed what they saw. Then, with a steady but firm voice, she looked at Rick and said, "You built your reputation by appraising objects, but you forgot one thing that can't be appraised or pawned: integrity." Rick turned away at that moment. At that moment, everyone realized that this trial wasn't just about punishing a man. It was about reclaiming the truth music, and Pam Bondi wasn't just a prosecutor, she was defender of that truth. The public lost faith in Rick Harrison, but Bondi didn't celebrate. She saw it as a necessary cleansing, and it had only just begun because it was never just about the accusations. In high-profile criminal cases, accusations are often seen as sensational. Speculation and certainty are separated by clear and irrefutable evidence, which is exactly what Pam Bondi brought to the courtroom when she walked in holding a stack of carefully put-together documents. The reporters covering the case later gave the stack of documents a nickname, the receipts. These weren't just spreadsheets or scribbled notes. They were carefully time-stamped, notarized, and verified documents collected from there were years of financial records, surveillance footage, expert testimony, subpoenaed emails, and even international cooperation. It wasn't just a smoking gun, it was a whole arsenal. The courtroom was packed that day. The tension was palpable. Every spectator, journalist, and legal expert knew they were about to witness a turning point that would decide whether Rick Harrison was just careless or actually planning something. Pam Bondi stepped forward and put the file on the prosecutor's table she opened the file slowly, but with the sharp confidence of a surgeon. She flipped to the first page. "Let's start with the money," she said. The first part of the evidence exposed a decade-long financial manipulation scheme. Bondi started with the tax evasion charges, which are a serious crime in and of themselves. Rick's financial reports over the years showed income from his pawn shop and TV appearances, but according to forensic accountants, those numbers didn't tell the whole story. Dozens of large payments, some worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, were sent through companies registered in the Caribbean, especially the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. On paper, these companies had vague business purposes, such as consulting, investing, or trading artifacts, but when Bondi's team followed the money, they found that most of these companies only existed on paper. One company, Bronze Vault, was actually real. Holdings LLC received a $750,000 wire transfer from Rick's personal account. The money was then broken up into smaller amounts and sent to accounts in Panama and Zurich. The problem was that there were no invoices, contracts, or recorded transactions, just money disappearing into a financial maze. Another shocking document showed that Rick had said he bought an unknown historical artifact for $320,000, but when investigators looked for it, they couldn't find it in the inventory or on the TV show. It was a fake. According to Bondi, the numbers on the screen behind her showed what the IRS audit team had found. Each number was a final nail in the coffin. "This is not careless accounting," she said. "This is a system built to deceive, a structure built to hide." But it wasn't just money. The next part of the receipts showed artifacts that had been bought, sold, and shown without a clear history. Bondi pointed out 17 specific items that had raised suspicions during the investigation. Each one had a story, a history, and a missing origin. One of the most shocking was centuries old Torah scroll that was thought to have been stolen during World War II from a Jewish family in Poland. It had been missing for decades until it showed up in Rick's collection. He had bought it from a Bondi showed a picture of the carefully restored scroll that was sold by a private dealer in Prague through an intermediary company. The transaction documents were fake and identifying marks had been erased. "This isn't just paper and ink," she said. "This is sacred. This is someone's history, and it was traded like a souvenir." The courtroom went silent as more artifacts were shown. These included a Native American ceremonial pipe that was reported stolen from a museum in New Mexico, a 15th-century samurai sword that was missing from a private collection in Osaka, and a Roman coin that was thought to have been illegally dug up from an archaeological site in Tunisia. One by one, Bondi explained how these artifacts got into Rick Harrison's hands. She found the fake documents and shell companies and tracked down the people who paid for them. The prosecution called in experts to check the artifacts, and a historian who testified said, "These artifacts don't just belong in glass cases, they belong to the community, to the nation, to their stories." Emails shown in court showed that Rick had negotiated deals using phrases like "don't ask questions" and "keep this quiet." In a different email, Rick told a third party to ship an item with fake papers, saying, "Just like last time, these messages were not ambiguous, they were admissions." Bondi also showed records of private flights used to transport artifacts. From Istanbul to Las Vegas, a chartered plane with the name of a fake company flew over $1 million worth of unclaimed historical goods. Rick was on board, and the items never showed up in the pawn shop's inventory or on TV. Were later found in the secret basement under his house. The defense tried to say that Rick wasn't directly involved in every transaction and that he trusted his team and advisors, but Bondi was ready. She showed text messages that Rick had signed and security footage from the pawn shop that showed Rick inspecting seized artifacts just days after they were shipped. It was overwhelming, not just because of the amount of evidence, but also because of how well it all fit together. Then there was the surveillance footage. The FBI had taken months' worth of data from Rick's home and storage facilities. In one clip, Rick was seen moving boxes labeled with archival materials into a secret area in his basement at night. In another, he was caught on camera telling a guest that some things would never see the light of day unless the price was right. The prosecution paused the video and zoomed in on a notebook Rick was holding. This notebook, which had been seized during a search, had written names in code on it. There were lists of artifacts, their purchase prices, and their resale prices. Some entries were marked with red dots. Bondi looked at the jury and said, "Each dot is a lie he thought he could bury." The courtroom went silent. Lawyers following the case in real time started to realize that this wasn't just about a pawn shop or a TV show. It was about a man who used fame and trust to hide crimes that crossed borders and broke international laws. Rick sat still, his eyes closed. Instead of giving a powerful speech, she placed the last document on the table and looked directly at the jury, saying, "This is not a mistake. This is a person who made a choice time and time again. He chose profit over truth. He chose himself over history, and now it's time to choose justice." The judge called a recess, but no one moved. Reporters kept writing. Jurors whispered to each other that the public's view of Rick Harrison, the once trusted face of American reality TV, had completely changed. Shattered. Those receipts didn't just prove guilt, they changed the whole story. It wasn't just a game of haggling over a baseball card or a signed guitar. It was a crime that was hidden in plain sight behind the glow of TV lights and sold as family entertainment. The story would never be the same again. For years, Rick Harrison had built the image of a close-knit family-run pawn shop where trust was the currency. On the outside, gold and silver pawn shop looked perfect. The father and son were old friends who had become coworkers, and the two generations were bound by work and shared values. But as the legal noose began to tighten, the truth became much more fragile. The first cracks didn't show up under the stage lights. They happened behind closed doors in quiet meetings, short phone calls, and long silences between coworkers who used to laugh together on TV. When Rick Harrison's case went public, the image he had worked so hard to create started to fall apart piece by piece. The government's plan was simple: put pressure on Rick's inner circle. He couldn't do it by himself. The size of the crime, the forgery, the sophisticated money laundering network, and the international deals, all of it needed help, whether it was given voluntarily or under duress. Now, many of them were being asked to choose between loyalty and freedom. The first person to speak out wasn't someone most people would expect. It was Melissa Gordon, a financial assistant at the pawn shop. Shop was someone that most people didn't see, but she had worked with Rick for almost 10 years. She paid the bills, checked the books, and signed off on the daily cash reports. Melissa had never said anything bad about Rick or tried to get attention, but when federal agents came to her door with a subpoena and evidence, she broke. Her testimony was a turning point in the case. In a sworn affidavit, Melissa described a culture of manipulation in the company and said she had been told to make 2 sets of books, one for internal use and one for tax purposes. She was told that some transactions were to be kept in the room at all times. To make things worse, she admitted that she knew some of the things she bought had shady origins. "I asked Rick about an item that didn't have a serial number or any paperwork," she said, shaking on the stand. He said, "Don't worry, it's clean enough." The courtroom was shaken. The 2 words, "clean enough," echoed throughout the rest of the trial. Melissa's confession opened the floodgates. The next to testify was Dean Carson, a longtime security supervisor and logistics manager for Rick's private vault. He admitted to personally overseeing the receipt of several unregistered artifacts, sometimes at night, sometimes through the back door, always paid in cash. "Did you ever ask where they came from?" the prosecutor asked. "I asked once," Carson replied. He said, "Once it's in my hands." It's Rick's short answer painted a clear picture of a man who thought ownership was based on possession. Legality was replaced by confidence, and he thought his reputation exempted him from all rules. But the most shocking testimony came from someone the TV audience knew very well: Rick's son, Corey Harrison. For years, Corey had stood by his father on and off screen and many saw him as the heir apparent and a skilled negotiator who would eventually take over the pawn shop. But as the trial went on, it became clear that Rick was not the one who Corey had been kept in the dark or even left out when things got dirty. Under a lot of pressure and public scrutiny, Corey finally agreed to testify, and what he said shocked everyone. He said that he had started to notice problems a few years ago, like things going missing from the vault and no one being able to find them, sales transactions being recorded without a buyer's name, and one time he questioned a $150,000 transaction that was processed through a consulting firm that hadn't existed for 6 months. Corey recalled, "I was pinned down." He said that his father told him not to ask questions because there were things bigger than the shop, bigger than the store itself. Those words carried a lot of weight in the room. It wasn't just about business. It was about secrets, power, and maybe even fear. Corey also admitted that his relationship with Rick had grown tense over the years. While they still seemed close on TV, they hardly spoke behind the scenes. He said Rick had started pulling away, spending more time in private meetings, going to Europe, and making deals that had nothing to do with the family or the shop. "I thought he might be just trying to grow the business, but now I realize he was hiding something." Even Chumlee, who made the show funny and had always publicly defended Rick, was called to testify. Even though he wasn't directly involved in the crimes, his words carried emotional weight as he talked about a growing sense of unease in the last few years of the show, and a change in Rick used to care about every little thing, but lately, Chumlee said, it seemed like he just wanted to get the deal done quickly, with no questions asked. Chumlee admitted that he had seen Rick paying cash for things in the alleys behind the shop. He had been asked to stay in the store during deliveries, and when he asked Rick, he refused to answer. He always had an answer. Chumlee said, "But after a while I stopped asking. Maybe I didn't want to know." This feeling echoed through some employees said they felt trapped because they didn't know whether to quit and be suspected or stay on and risk being involved. Some stayed because they believed in Rick and thought he knew what he was doing and was too smart to get caught. But now that the law was closing in on everyone, the legend of Rick Harrison was falling apart, and the inner circle was not only falling apart, but it was also destroying itself. One of the last witnesses called was Maria Thorne, a retired customs officer who she talked about a time when she was worried about Rick's methods and cut ties with him. "I warned him," she said. "I told him that the paperwork trails were too thin, that if the government came looking, he wouldn't be able to hide it." She said Rick's response was to smile and say, "They're not coming. I'm golden on TV." That arrogance, that belief in his own invincibility, had been the thread holding his empire together, but now that thread was unraveling, and those who helped build the empire were stepping forward not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. Prosecutors played messages between Rick and his close advisor. One message read, "If it comes to that, just stay quiet, we're all together." But the carefully built brotherhood was now nothing more than a house of cards by the weekend. Bondi had exposed not only a string of crimes, but also a culture of threats to keep quiet and unchecked power. Rick Harrison, who once said that loyalty was the most important thing, was now seeing his closest friends testify against him in court. And maybe the most important moment didn't come from the evidence, but from Rick himself. When Corey left the witness stand, he quickly looked at his father, Rick. Didn't look back at him, didn't nod, didn't move, he just turned away. The silence between them spoke louder than any word's music. The empire Rick had built wasn't just falling apart because of the law. It was falling apart because the people who had stood by him, his inner circle, his friends and his family, were turning their backs on him and leaving. For years, rumors had been going around about Rick Harrison's private collection, and fans of the show had spent hours online speculating about what he might be hiding behind closed doors. What no one, not even Rick's closest friends and employees, knew was that below the surface of his huge Las Vegas property, he had built something much scarier, a vault. Not just any vault, but a climate-controlled, high-security storage room built beneath the guest house. The door was designed to blend in with the wall of the wine cellar, and there was no outside sign or public architectural plans. It had been built through a later, when questioned, the contractor admitted that he had been paid in cash and told to keep the vault a secret. When it was opened, it turned Rick Harrison's criminal case from serious to explosive. The vault's existence was first found during a raid on Harrison's home. Based on information from forensic accountants, federal agents thought that some artifacts that hadn't been reported might not have been kept at the pawn shop, but at his home. Surveillance footage and bank records showed that big packages were being sent to his home instead of the store. When the police arrived, they didn't find anything unusual in the house, even though it was very nice. There were no obvious safes, large display rooms, or signs of a private museum. But things took a strange turn when one of the detectives noticed a small mistake in the floor plan. According to the real estate documents, the lower level was supposed to be over 5,000 square feet, but it was only about 300 square feet were found, but 700 square feet were missing. It was a small detail, but it blew the whole case wide open when agents came back with engineers and thermal tools and found a hidden layer of insulation behind a wall in the wine cellar, hidden among the wine racks and decorative crates. A false door led into a hallway with reinforced concrete walls, and at the end of that hallway was the vault. The door used fingerprint recognition, retina scanning, and a backup code that only Rick knew. It took over 2 hours and a team of locksmiths to open it. And what they found inside was even better than they had imagined. The shelves were packed full of carefully labeled and preserved items, but unlike a private collection of historical artifacts, these items were not listed in any official records. There were no auction receipts or sales invoices to prove ownership. Instead, the vault held artifacts that had been erased from public records and were only found in museum registries, stolen property databases, and black market websites. One shelf had a group of ancient Egyptian statues that may have been stolen from a tomb in Luxor. Another shelf had a velvet box with 6 ancient Byzantine coins, one of which was on Interpol's list of stolen items. There was also a medieval gold chalice with jewels that had been reported missing from a church in France in 1999. But the most haunting thing in the room might have been a piece of a Torah scroll that had been preserved in glass and showed signs of matching a copy that was thought to have been lost during the Holocaust. It was found untouched and silent, like a strange relic. One agent later wrote in his official report, "This is not a collection gallery, it is a tomb, a cemetery of stolen history." There were more than 200 items, some small enough to fit in a shoebox and others so big they needed large crates. Each one was valuable and didn't have any legal paperwork to back it up. Investigators spent days cataloging the artifacts, calling in historians, art crime experts, and representatives from international organizations working to protect cultural heritage, sealed the vault, and sent pictures of the artifacts to police all over the world. This led to a wave of confirmations. The Vatican confirmed that an item stolen from an Italian monastery was theirs. A museum in Mexico City claimed ownership of an Aztec statue that had been missing for 10 years. The British Museum temporarily linked a stolen fossil to their collection, and even the Smithsonian started an internal audit after seeing pictures of a diary from the Civil War that matched a missing item from a temporary exhibition. Each new piece of evidence put Rick's legal situation in greater danger. The charges of trafficking in stolen cultural property, which were already very serious, now had an international reach. Governments wanted answers, and cultural groups spoke out against the illegal trade and worship of their stolen heritage. Rick's name, which used to be linked to history and education, was now linked to the dark world of artifact trafficking in court. Pam Bondi talked about the vault. As a personal museum of stolen goods, The defense quickly countered by saying that Rick had bought many of the items legally through middlemen, and that he didn't know about their shady origins because he was just a simple buyer who was ripped off by dishonest sellers. However, this defense quickly fell apart because emails that Bondi's team had collected showed that Rick had personally looked at some of the items. For example, when he bought an ancient African ceremonial mask, he wrote, "This item won't pass public scrutiny, keep it off." Another email about a shipment from South America had a simple message, "No customs, no receipts." The vault's silence told a story of accumulation, but it also told a story of intent. The items were not placed randomly. They were chosen and displayed with respect, both because they were historically important and because no one else could have them. It was the ultimate contradiction. Rick Harrison had built his reputation on making history available to everyone, but in secret he was hoarding it, and what the vault revealed went beyond breaking the law. It revealed a deeper psychological profile of a man obsessed with ownership, not just money or fame, but also control over the story, control over the past music. The prosecutors asked a forensic psychologist to explain this way of thinking, and she said, "Some people who know a lot about history and are admired by the public start to believe that they alone are worthy of protecting that history." She added, "It's not just about hiding things, it's about rewriting owning." The last thing found in the vault was a leather-bound journal with Rick's signature and personal notes about some of the things in his collection. One entry talked about buying a stolen 17th century telescope, and another was excited about buying a Roman dagger in Istanbul in a way that couldn't be tracked. "These people don't value what they have," one line said. "I do. I know how much it's worth." The jury was shocked when they heard that the secret vault had changed the outcome of the trial. It wasn't just physical evidence, it was a metaphor come to life. The truth that had been hidden was finally revealed. Rick Harrison had not only crossed a line, he had buried it underground and locked it away. From that point on, there was no going back, no more doubt, and no more excuses. The vault wasn't just a crime scene, it was a confession, and the world would never see Rick Harrison the same way again. Again, it started out like any other day in court. The walls were the same, the judge stayed calm, and the courtroom was full of reporters, lawyers, and curious onlookers. But there was a different kind of tension in the air. Everyone was holding their breath, knowing that something big was about to happen. They were right. Today was the day the prosecution would drop the bombshells that would silence the defense, shock the whole courtroom, and make headlines around the world. Rick Harrison, who was once the face of reality TV star Rick Ross, was no longer just on trial. He was about to become a symbol of how fame, unchecked power, and criminal schemes could collide in the strangest way. Pam Bondi started the session with a new witness, one who wasn't on the original list. That was a surprise. The defense, after a short discussion, Judge Elkins let the testimony continue. The witness, Andre Duca, was a former European antiquities dealer who had sold Rick valuable historical items. It was shocking because he had disappeared from the world of antiquities 5 years ago after being accused of trafficking stolen artifacts from Syria. He avoided prosecution by working with Interpol, but no one knew where he was until now, when Bondi called him to the stand. Under oath, Duca confirmed what many people had only thought, that Harrison wasn't just a buyer, he was an active member of illegal trade network. "I didn't go to him," Harrison said. "He came to me because he knew what I had." He went on to talk about a meeting in a dark room at a private auction house in Barcelona where Rick bought 4 rare manuscripts, one of which was thought to have been stolen from an archaeological site in Syria. The payment was made in a briefcase with $90,000 in cash with no contract, no receipt, and no questions asked. Bondi then showed Duca emails, including one from Rick that said, "As long as it's real, I don't care where it comes from." That meeting changed everything. The defense quickly questioned Duca's credibility, but the damage had already been done. The jury had seen what was really going on. Rick wasn't just a pawn shop owner or reality TV star. He was also someone who wanted to sell history. The second bombshell came in the form of surveillance audio. Pam Bondi had gotten recordings from a confidential informant who used to work with Rick and wore a recording device to a series of meetings in Las Vegas 2 years before the trial. Subject K, whose name was only given as K, had met with Rick several times to talk about deals, and audio recordings played in court showed damaging conversations. In one recording, Rick was heard saying, "We keep the big ones quiet, no show, no records, just us." In another, he said, "Some things are worth more because they're outside the system. Museums don't get that. I display them." Rick's voice was clear. Calm, confident, even proud, he wasn't cornered but in charge of the situation. But it was the recording that really at first, the tip that led to Rick's arrest seemed harmless. An informant asked about a very expensive Native American ceremonial headdress that had been stolen from a tribal museum 20 years before. In the recording, Rick said, "That's not for sale, it's mine." When asked why, he sneered and said, "Because no one else will ever have a chance to touch it again, that's why." His words were cold, cruel, and for many people unforgivable. There was a collective gasp in the courtroom, and Native American people sitting in the back stood up and silently walked out. Rick sat still, his eyes no longer clear, and his jaw clenched. When the recording ended, he seemed smaller, as if diminished. The mask had finally broken. Then came the emotional high point of the trial. Pam Bondi called an unexpected witness to the stand, Joseph Harrison, Rick's younger brother. Unlike Corey, Joseph had never been on Pawn Stars. Instead, he had chosen a quiet life in Arizona. However, their relationship had become tense in recent years, and Joseph had contacted Rick about an item that their late father had given him, a Navy medal from Vietnam that had been passed down as a family heirloom. Joseph said that the item mysteriously disappeared from his home during a family gathering months later. When he saw a medal that looked on an episode of Pawn Stars, I called him. Joseph said, "I asked him if he had it, and he told me I was imagining things." Bondi paused the clip and showed it to Rick in court. It was the medal with the same engraving on the back and the same faded ribbon. "You stole it from your own brother," Bondi said, looking directly at Rick. Lawyers objected, but the jury was shocked and felt betrayed if he could lie to his own brother. Bondi made a smart move at the end of the trial by letting Rick speak for himself. Even though his lawyer told him to stay quiet, Rick chose to address the court because he thought he could still control the story and convince everyone. But when he stood up, took a deep breath, and started to speak, something strange happened. His voice started to shake. He tried to explain that it was all a mistake, that he hadn't known he had trusted the wrong people, that everything had gotten too big. As he spoke, his calm broke. Everyone in the courtroom looked at Rick Harrison, the man who would never blink on TV and who had never backed out of a deal. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he said with tears in his eyes. "I just got too deep. I thought I could handle it." He couldn't finish the sentence. He looked up at his family, his son, his brother, and his old friends, but all he saw were empty stares. His voice broke again. "I'm sorry, but it was too late," he said. Pam Bondi stood slowly, saying nothing. She didn't give a big speech. She just said, "The truth has spoken for itself." And it had. The courtroom had turned into a stage, and Rick Harrison had just done the worst thing of his life. He wasn't a TV star. He was a man who wouldn't listen until the truth came down like a waterfall. No one had any doubts about the outcome when the court closed that day. The bombs had gone off, and Rick Harrison would never be able to put the pieces back together. Thanks for watching the video. The Rick Harrison case will make a lot of people think. If you want to stay up to date on the latest news, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you found this video interesting, please share it. See you in the next video.